All right, let's begin to wrap up this chapter. So, want a balanced budget? Sell some government assets. So, Iraq's government has been considering raising revenues by selling a large amount of its real estate, including presidential palaces previously constructed by Saddam Hussein. Like Iraq, a number of other governments around the world have raised revenues by selling their assets in order to reduce their net public debt. So maybe that's something we could consider doing. I don't know, selling some public lands or something. I don't know how popular that would be, though. So that is one option. All right, let's also think about these issues and applications. Is fiscal policy drowning in accumulated budgetary red ink, or deficit, in other words? So the federal government projects that the annual net interest payment on the net public debt will more than double between now and 2025, although this is probably even worse now that we've faced this coronavirus pandemic and it incurred $4 trillion worth of additional debt in the past 2 months. So it's probably more like triple or quadruple at this point, although maybe not because of the low interest rates. So we'll see. We'll have to see when the numbers come out here in the next few months and towards the end of the year. But as a result, the portion of GDP that the government can allocate to discretionary funding, right, things like education and national parks and those sorts of things, is going to have to go down. Okay. So here we've got the actual and projected net interest payments on public debt. So projected beyond, I think 2017 is the latest year. So beyond here, it's projected. So here we've got the debt that the government has paid in the last several years is, slightly above $200 billion a year. A lot of interest. And then it just increases pretty gradually, pretty steadily, up to towards $800 billion in 2025, although it'll probably be close to $1 trillion by then, given what we've borrowed recently. Here we see actual and projected net interest payments on public debt from 2014 to 2015. So we've got the net interest cost as a percent of GDP. So this is basically the red line we just saw in the last graph, but as a percentage of GDP. And then the purple line is discretionary spending. So while our interest payments are going up, our discretionary spending on things like education and national parks and things like that is going down. All right, let's wrap this up by summarizing our learning objectives. So we first looked at explaining how federal government budget deficits occur, right? And we then defined what public debt means. We saw that there's a flow that occurs every single year. So when the government has to borrow money because it doesn't raise enough in taxes, that's a deficit, which we have experienced in most years over the past 80 years or more. And then those deficits increase our public debt, right, which is a stock measurement, right? So again, we saw that federal budget deficits are flows, and the accumulated deficits, which are a stock, are called the public debt. And then we looked at, evaluating the circumstances under which this public debt can burden future generations, and it's going to either be through higher taxes, which of course means we can't consume as much, and it might also burden the future generations, through crowding out, right, reducing economic growth. Then we looked at analyzing the macroeconomic effects of government budget deficits. Because higher government budget deficits are caused by increased government spending or tax cuts, they can contribute to short-run rises in total expenditures and aggregate demand, getting us out of a recessionary gap, perhaps, or pushing us into an inflationary gap. But in the long run, these increased deficits only act to redistribute resources from the private sector to the public sector. We also looked at describing possible ways to reduce the government budget deficit and/or debt, and that could be done through increasing taxes. It could also be done through reducing expenditures, either by it would primarily have to be done by revising those entitlement programs, which take up a majority of the budget. All right, that's the chapter on government deficits and debt. I hope you enjoyed it and you saw how it ties directly in with the last chapter we looked at with fiscal policy. These two chapters are basically, two peas in a pod. They go together directly with one another. Next, we'll be looking at monetary policy, which is another way for the government, although I shouldn't really say the government. It's kind of the government, but it's not. It's another way for the government to sort of manipulate the economy, but through money policy, monetary policy. And that has to do with the Federal Reserve Bank, which technically isn't part of the government, but I don't know, it's kind of a blurry line there. So that's where we're headed. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Make sure you are completing your discussion posts and completing your quizzes by the due dates. And also, don't let yourself get behind on the homeworks. I know I revised it so that they don't have a due date and you can basically do them at your leisure, but don't get behind on them so that you have a bunch to do at the end of the term. That would not be a good idea. Okay? Plus, you should be using the homeworks in order to prepare for the quizzes. Okay, so thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.